Okay, welcome back. I don't know why I always start with like okay or whatever whenever I start these videos. You know what? This is as much a learning experience for me as it is for you. I'm just learning different things. Anyways, so we are going to be talking about demand side shocks. Now, this was supposed to just be one big lecture. So it was going to be a 5-part series with 5 actual videos. But instead, it looks like what it's going to be is a 5-part series somehow with 6 actual videos. Because as I started coming up with um, the lecture slides for this particular lecture, I realized fairly quickly that it was going to be really long. And like this slide alone, or this lecture slide series, is likely to be very long in and of itself. And there's another one that follows, although that one is not anywhere near as long. So, woohoo, or something. I don't really know. But let's just move on here. So we figured out how we were going to derive aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. And then we put them together both graphically and algebraically. And now it's time to talk about the shocks to the system and how everything responds back to a stable long run equilibrium. Now, these shocks will have a short run response, and then there's going to be a long run response as well. We're going to start with the short run responses, right? Because, I mean, that's kind of what happens first. And then we will talk about how we converge to the long run equilibrium, right? Like we're going to talk about what the long run response is, but only after we've covered the short run response. Now, bear in mind throughout all of this lecture and the next one that the goal of monetary policy is to impact the short run behavior through changes in aggregate demand, right? Monetary policy is not meant to explicitly impact long run behavior, and it's not meant to impact or we'll say shift anything on the supply side of the economy. Now, it makes depending on the slope of the short run aggregate supply curve, right, there will be changes to the quantity supplied via shifts in aggregate demand, right? But they're not explicitly changing anything in supply itself. Monetary policy is not particularly well suited for dealing with supply side shocks, right? They can deal with demand side shocks exceedingly well. Supply side, not so much. Now, the long run equilibria here are going to be determined by real factors. That implies monetary neutrality. So, in that case, right, the monetary authority can't change long run growth type stuff. All they can do is impact aggregate demand and exploit the upward, however, not vertical slope of the short run aggregate supply curve to change output and inflation. Because if they're trying to exploit the vertical long run aggregate supply curve, they're not going to change output. They're only going to change inflation. They're going to increase inflation, and that's not exactly particularly good for the monetary authority, right? So this is done through their consideration to monitor both output and inflation. It's what's known as the dual mandate, right? In the U.S., the dual mandate is unemployment and inflation, but here what we're doing is we're treating it as output and inflation because we don't have anything for unemployment in this model. So general equilibrium. It's this, right? So we saw this last time in the last lecture where I just was like, boom, here it is. Put it together, done, right? This is the general equilibrium. So this is going to be the starting point for every type of shock that we look at. Now we're going to start with demand shocks first. Now with demand shocks, right, it can either come from shocks to the IS curve, which would be changes in A bar, C bar, I bar, T bar, G bar. Now you can see actually here, right, there's a bar over the G instead of just bar G or whatever, and NX bar, right? Changes to any of these autonomous components will be changing the IS curve. It'll be changing the position of the IS curve, right? A shock that leads to a shift in the IS curve thus shifts the aggregate demand curve. Monetary policy shocks would be changes in R bar, which is, again, the changes in the autonomous monetary policy component of the monetary policy equation. Excuse me. It's allergies, not COVID. Watch YouTube flag me now for being like, oh, you're spreading misinformation or something. Anyways, either an IS shock or a monetary policy shock will shift demand. And the way demand actually moves, if we're looking at just the demand supply stuff, right? not really going to be very different from an IS or a monetary policy shock. Now, what happens to the IS curve and what happens to the monetary policy curves, those will be exceedingly different. But what happens solely to demand and the ADAS equilibrium, that won't be very different, like at all. The difference, though, is like I said, in the interest rate response and also the movement of the IS curve, because the IS curve moves in one of these shocks, but it does not move in the other. And the interest rates move in opposite directions depending on what the source of the demand shock is. It will increase when there's an IS shock. It will decrease when there's a monetary policy shock. So in the IS shock, interest rate goes up. Monetary policy shock, interest rate goes down. In terms of the demand shock, right, ADAS equilibrium shock / responses are going to be the same. Cool. So here's an aggregate demand shock, right? Let's see what's going on here. Well, aggregate demand shifts from this AD0, right, that black AD curve, to the pink one, AD1. It shifts out. Now, we're holding short run and long run aggregate supply fixed, right? Because whenever we look at one of these shocks, we will keep everything except that one thing that we're shifting constant, right? So it's not like I'm going to shift demand and supply at the same time. No, I'm going to shift demand, right? Get a look at what's going on. And then if I want to do a supply shock later in that system, I'll shift supply, but I'm not going to shift them simultaneously. We do one at a time. So I shift aggregate demand out, right? Output goes up, inflation goes up, because with a demand shock, right, remember output and prices move in the same direction. Now it's going to shift along that short run aggregate supply curve, right? Because the short run equilibrium is going to be determined by where aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply intersect with one another. Hence, that's why we have an increase to output rather than solely an increase to inflation, which is what we would see if it just moved along that long run aggregate supply and we just didn't pay any attention to short run aggregate supply. So output and inflation increase here. We're going to be looking right here, right, where I'm hovering the mouse, a little hand, right? That little hand here is telling me where this guy is intersecting. This is the equilibrium that we're curious about, the equilibrium we're looking at. So when there's a demand shock, aggregate demand shifts along this short-run aggregate supply curve and a new equilibrium occurs. But this isn't the long-run equilibrium. Why isn't it the long-run equilibrium? Well, right, this equilibrium right here is not crossing the long-run aggregate supply curve, right? It's actually pretty far away from the long-run aggregate supply curve. So not long-run. Output and inflation both increase, which is consistent with the theory about a demand shock. And since it's a demand shock, right, it's a demand side shock, potential output remains unaffected because real factors aren't driving this shock. And if real factors, right, a shock to the labor market, a shock to capital markets, or a shock to technology, right, those things aren't driving this shock. None of those three things I just listed are behind a demand shock. Therefore, not a supply shock, long-run aggregate supply doesn't move. But the move along short-run aggregate supply means the output gap is now positive, which is not sustainable in the long run, right? This only occurred because prices are slow to respond immediately to shocks. So not all firms can increase their prices in order to ration their products, right? Because if you get this shock, is that $5 footlong example I gave in the previous video, right? With that $5 footlong, it could look really bad and people are going to stop coming to buy your subs if you just immediately drop that $5 footlong campaign, even though, you know, you're well within like good, reasonable, reasons to do so. It doesn't really look very good to the public, right? So not everybody can change their prices all at once. So in some cases, they have to increase production instead. But in the long run, prices become more flexible. More firms can increase their prices. And as more firms increase their prices, short-run aggregate supply is going to shift to the left, thereby increasing the inflation rate and reducing output. Right? We're essentially going to return to our long-run equilibrium level of output. So this is the first little bit of an adjustment, right? So we went from the black equilibrium point here over to the pink one, right? But then short run aggregate supply shifts in. Now, short run aggregate supply doesn't just like immediately shift all the way back to this point right here where the mouse is. No, not really. What it's doing is it's going to slowly shift back over time and eventually converge to this long run equilibrium. So the first equilibrium after the shock would be this pink set of pink dotted lines here, right? Where we've got yt plus 1 and pi t plus 1. Now in the next period, a couple of firms are able to change their prices. Not all of them, but a couple were. So because a couple of firms are able to change their prices, right, short run aggregate supply shifts back a little bit. So when it shifts back, inflation goes up, right? Inflation goes up because firms were able to change their prices, which they weren't able to do in that first period after the shock. So because some firms are able to change their prices, right, a little bit less gets supplied. So yt plus 2 is a little bit less than yt plus 1. And pi t plus 2 is a little bit more than pi t plus 1. So we have a higher rate of inflation and a lower level of output. Okay. So far, so good, right? We just shifted short run aggregate supply back, and we looked at what the new equilibrium is, right? So like I said, we shift one thing at a time. The first thing we shifted was aggregate demand. And then after we shifted aggregate demand, now we're going to start shifting aggregate supply as producers get used to what the new equilibrium is as they are able to change their prices more and more. So the next period, right? Well, short run aggregate supply shifts in a little bit more because an additional firm, let's say Subway this time, was able to go from a $5 foot long to like a $7 foot long or something like that, right? Been enough time. They've seen this probably isn't going to be like a transitory thing, right? And they're like, okay, well, input costs are going up. They're going to keep going up. We've got to raise prices. So when they raise prices, you're going to have an increase in inflation. And so short run aggregate supply shifts in a little bit. They raise prices, inflation goes up. When they raise prices, inflation goes up, output's going to drop a little bit. So we go from yt plus 2 to yt plus 3, right? So now the new equilibrium we're in is this one with the purple dotted lines. It plus 3, yt plus 3. And so as firms can change their prices, as more firms are able to change their prices, inflation increases and output begins to fall. Now, the reason for this is that when the output gap is positive, firms are producing above their efficient level of production. Now, recall that for the firm, what they want to do is they want to produce at a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I'm not going to go through the derivation of this. You can find plenty of these derivations online. If you want to see the derivation in another video, just let me know. And we can go from there. But they produce at the point where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal to each other. Any point above that, right, you're going to have higher marginal costs than what is efficient. And if you've got higher than efficient marginal costs, then why in the hell are you going to be producing there, right? In the short run, you might kind of have to, but in the long run, you'd rather not. So in the long run, you're going to be able to increase your prices. When you increase your prices, right, your marginal costs are going to be falling because you're producing a little bit less. You're getting back to what your efficient level of production is, right? Because anything above the output level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost is a point of production that's no longer cost minimizing. Now remember, when you minimize costs, you are therefore implying profit maximization. But profit maximization does not necessarily imply cost minimization. So a lot of times it's good to do a cost minimization problem. Therefore, you can imply a profit maximization problem, but whatever. Firms don't want that stuff, right? Firms want MR equals MC. They want to produce there. They want to price on the demand curve. Right now, they can't produce there. Well, they can't produce there, and they can't really price where they would like to because they are unable to change their prices. So they have to make more stuff, which is not good. Kind of pisses them off, right? We'd like to think it would be a lot better if actual output was above potential, right? But it's an inefficient level of production, even though it seems like it'd be efficient, right? Like more stuff, more production would be great, right? Well, yeah, but it's coming at a higher cost. It's coming at a much more inefficient cost. to produce, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And the economy will begin to restabilize as prices go up and firms produce closer to their efficient points of production. Right? So firms get to raise their prices. When they raise their prices, they get to be able to produce closer and closer and closer to where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, when everything renormalizes, right, we're at 81, right? That was that first aggregate demand. Because aggregate demand shifts once and that's it in this case. Short run aggregate supply shifts a bunch of times. And it stops at, we'll call it SRAS N, right, for N periods. And it stops when it is equal to long run aggregate supply and the new aggregate demand. When that happens, boom, we're at our long run equilibrium again, right? You can think of it as like a steady state, right? We're in our steady state when that happens. Sound it out, Jeremy. Output returns to what it was prior to the shock, but we now have a much higher rate of inflation because agents have now updated their prices based on the demand shock, right? They've updated their prices based on what they have observed. They go, oh, wow, okay, you hit me with that. Kind of like fool me once, shame on you, right? Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, you're not going to fool me twice because I just went, cool. I saw what you did. I incorporated what you did into my information set, and I have therefore adapted my expectation structure, and my prices have been changed accordingly. So short run aggregate supply keeps shifting back. So if you look at the subscript here, SRAS 1, 2, it'd be like, 3 around here, 4, 5, whatever, all the way up to N, right? For N movements of the short run aggregate supply back to where it crosses aggregate demand 1 and the long run aggregate supply. And we end up at a long run equilibrium of pi t plus n, right, for n periods after the shock, however many periods it takes to return back to its steady state, and the original level of output we had, yt superscript 0. Right, so as soon as short run aggregate supply shifts back, you're going to keep wanting to shift it back until it crosses this point right here, right? When short run aggregate supply crosses where aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply intersect, right? That is the new steady state inflation rate and the steady state level of output, right? This is sort of where everything tries to sort of return back. It's like its state of rest. So we saw what happened to output and price, right? But what happens to the interest rate? All right, well, let's assume that this was an IS shock, right? So it's triggered by, we'll say, a shock to government spending, because why the hell not? So let's come up with a little story here. Let's say Congress wants to pass a spending bill that deposits $1,000 into everyone's bank accounts, totaling up to, I don't know, let's say $1 trillion, right? Is it too soon to use this as an example? Nah, it'll be fine. They want to do this, right? They want to pass a spending bill. So they're going to give everybody $1,000. They got to borrow funds to finance it. Now, explicitly in this model, we don't really have anything for borrowing funds, but let's just go ahead and just assume that they do it real quick. I know, just kind of. They have to borrow funds to finance it. As they borrow, the amount of funds that they can borrow, right? The money that they can borrow. And again, I know there's no actual money in this model, but the amount of money that can be borrowed is now dried up, right? Because it's been taken out of the system and it's been deposited into the accounts of various people to go spend. Now, it's not borrowed directly from the bank, right? Like the government doesn't just go to a bank and say, hey, we want to take out a loan. And the bank goes, okay, here's your interest rate, right? It doesn't really work that way. No. They write up bonds and they sell the bonds. That's like, hey, this is a bond. You give me, say, 10 grand for this bond and I'll repay it over some period plus interest. Now, that bond, right, gets, repaid. That bond's now got value. And so the government basically just borrowed stuff from the private sector in order to fund their public projects. Therefore, the amount of resources that the private sector now has to do stuff with has now shrunk tremendously, because the amount of resources that are available for projects that the private agents wanted to, do stuff with, because that's not really there as much. Well, the cost of borrowing, right, the cost of financing that stuff skyrockets. So I know there's no money in the model. Let's just sort of just assume for a second there's money in the model. There's less money available to be lent out. So the price of borrowing goes up. The price of borrowing goes up. The real interest rate goes up. That means the government spending bill is thus crowding out private investment. This is what's known as the crowding out effect. Interest rates are going to increase upon the initial shock, and there's going to be a little bit more to come on this. But first, I want to talk about what the crowding out effect is, because it's actually a pretty important topic. So here's how crowding out works. Think of the economy's GDP as a resource constraint. Now, I've zeroed out net exports, right? So we can either assume it's just a closed economy, or I can assume imports equals exports, and x just goes to 0. So I've just got y equals c plus I plus g. Right? Now, this is a resource constraint because the amount that you produce, y, is income, and it can only be split up between consumption, investment, and government spending. So think of y as income. In each period, it's already been determined, so it can't change. Why can't it change? Well, you have to know what amount of inputs you're going to put into producing stuff. So if you get hit with a shock this period, well, you've already decided what you're going to put into it. Like it's that, well, it's your bed. Now you got to, like, you made your bed. Now you got to sleep in it, sort of thing, right? You've already prepared for what it's going to be. You get something that for which you were unprepared, well, output's not going to move, right? You move tomorrow, but this time it's kind of stuck where it is. So if that's the case, you increase one of the components on the right-hand side of equation 1. You've got to take away from some of the other components. So c plus I plus g is how income can be spent. Consumption is assumed to be stable over time. It's what's known as consumption smoothing. It's actually the most stable component of these 3 components on the right-hand side of the equation. Investment's a lot more volatile. So what I'm going to do to show you this is I'm going to put this whole thing in percent changes. I'm going to color code stuff to make it nice and pretty for you. So the percent change in y is equal to percent change in c plus percent change in investment plus percent change in government spending. Right, so from that, right, from the percent change thing, well, output can't change right now. So percent change in y is just 0. Since consumption is pretty smooth and stable, and we're going to assume that when everybody gets $1,000 put into their account, very simplifying assumption, I know, very strict assumption, very unreasonable assumption in a lot of cases. We'll just assume for a second that everybody that gets that money deposited into their accounts just saves it. So I'm going to assume that consumption doesn't change. This really is a simplifying assumption, I know. So percent change C, percent change Y are 0. So if government spending were to go up, well, I've got 0 equals the change in investment plus the change in government spending. Okay, I'm sure you probably see where this is going right now. From this, I'll subtract percent change I from both sides, and I get this in equation 7. So if there's any change to government spending, right, so if, say, percent change in GT is greater than 0, percent change in IT is going to be less than 0. It's going to be negative. It reduces output growth tomorrow. Well, how does this reduce output growth, right? Well, recall that production function that I showed you before. Output's a function of capital. That's also a function of labor, but it's also a function of capital. Investment, right, that little IT that you see in y equals c plus I plus g, right? I is equal to this law of motion of capital, kt plus 1 minus delta times kt. IT is investment. KT plus 1 is capital purchased today to be used in production tomorrow. KT is capital purchased yesterday to be used today. Delta is the rate of depreciation on physical capital. Don't really worry so much about that. Investment drops, though. KT can't change because it was determined yesterday, right? Because KT was purchased yesterday to be used today. That's why I said GDP isn't going to change this period if there's some shock to something, right? It doesn't get to change this period because, well, the amount of existing capital is just there. That's just what it is. However, What will change GDP is if we change how much capital we purchase today. So KT plus 1, right? It's being bought today, but it's not actually being delivered and implemented until the next period. So, right, because if there's any big piece of equipment that you're ordering, okay, let's say, I don't know, because I have these fancy designs of maybe one day getting like super rich working in a bank that I'll be able to fly in like one of their private jets, right? Let's say they want a private jet. They want to get a Gulfstream, right? Well, if you want a Gulfstream, you don't just go to the Gulfstream store and pick one off the shelf and go, I want this one today, and then you take it home with you. It doesn't work that way. You have to put an order in for the plane. It gets built generally to your own custom specifications, and then eventually it gets delivered. Now you can use that for work operations, but you can't use it today, right? You can use it whenever it gets delivered. Let's say it gets delivered next quarter. So you order it today, but it doesn't exist today. It exists tomorrow. So that's why the KT plus 1 gets bought today, even though it doesn't exist today, but it's implemented into production tomorrow. So if investment drops today, right, you're going, oh, wow, I would have loved to have had the new G650, right? It's a really nice one. It's like a wide body. It's really cool, like swept up wings. It's all like fly-by-wire. I think it's fly-by-wire. It's got a little side stick, kind of like what the Airbus cockpits have. I'm a giant aviation nerd on top of like all the other nerd stuff I'm into. But it's really nice. But you're like, I can't afford that. So you get a measly Learjet instead because you can't afford the Gulfstream anymore. Now the Gulfstream's really nice because it's got a lot of seats in it. The Learjet, not so much, right? People are going to be crammed into the Learjet, and you're probably not going to be able to have as many people on that Learjet as you would have had on the Gulfstream. So if you got to go to a meeting, right? Well, you either send fewer people to the meeting, or you got to fly the Learjet like twice to get people there. But let's just assume it's going to fly once. You get fewer people there. Well, you get less efficient stuff in the banking sector going on, and ultimately production falls, right? Because you've got less capital to allow in the production from tomorrow. Because there's less capital going into this production function, right? Then firms buy less capital. There's less capital going into the production function. You got less capital that can be used tomorrow. So if I push this production function forward one period, right? So I just add 1 to every T subscript, right? I got this KT plus 1 here. KT plus 1 went down because I couldn't buy as much capital today. Since output tomorrow is a function of KT plus 1, right? Then YT plus 1 goes down. Or actually, in all likelihood, what's going to happen is it won't be as high as it would have been absent the shock, right? So let's say YT plus 1 would have been, I don't know, $28 trillion, but now it's like $27 trillion. Now, YT this period was, say, 25 trillion. It goes up either way, but it doesn't go up by as much. So it's still likely higher than today's output, but if there hadn't been a shock, YT plus 1 would be higher than what it actually is going to end up being. The output growth falls, if we want to be a little bit more precise in our terminology here. So if government expenditures increases by 10%, then we assume that output won't change this period, which is a reasonable assumption. And consumption will be smooth, and agents won't want to consume anymore. They're going to put all of it into savings. Not the most reasonable assumption. But just for the sake of simplicity here, we're going with this. Now, this negative percent change I equals percent change G. Well, if G goes up 10%, investment falls by 10%. Now, in reality, you'd see something like where consumption's increasing with a spike in government spending. You're going to get a slightly different response. But just for the sake of argument here, right, you can kind of see what's going on with the crowding out effect because there are fewer resources that can be invested because the government basically just took them all away. Now, back to the interest rate response. Whew, that was long. Since we saw how government spending crowds out private investment, the availability of loanable funds drops. The price of borrowing increases, firms borrow less, meaning they invest less, and output growth is going to be reduced in the future. And we can tell just from that narrative that interest rates will be going up. at least immediately in response to the government spending shock. But what happens is the short run aggregate supply curve begins to shift back in and output returns to its long run potential. Well, let's look at the monetary policy in the IS curve graphs, right? So remember, this guy right here exists directly above the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph that we looked at, right? And then this guy determines the monetary policy. So we're looking at this. This is what we were initially. This is the initial long run equilibrium, right? Put them all together, we kind of get something that looks like this. All right, and all I did was just put the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph right underneath the IS interest rate output space graph right there. Cool. So the government borrows more money. IS curve shifts out horizontally, and aggregate demand shifts horizontally by the same amount, right? So we're really just going to be recreating those demand shocks that we just saw, right? Where the IS, or the short run aggregate supply curve shifts in and in and in and in, right? We're going to be recreating that just with the IS and monetary policy stuff over it, so we can kind of see the way interest rates are responding here, right? So what happens is the IS curve shifts out, right? It's going to shift out some horizontal amount. Now we trace out how far it shifts out horizontally because aggregate demand shifts out by the exact same horizontal amount, right? This horizontal distance here is going to be the same. So that horizontal shift holding inflation constant gives us a point that isn't in equilibrium. Aggregate demand is not equal to short run aggregate supply, right? Because that's giving us a point right here. We are neither in equilibrium with short run aggregate supply or long run aggregate supply. Right? We're just kind of sitting out here all by our lonesome. So what has to happen? Well, we've got to be able to get back here. We have to get back here. Because right here, there's no equilibrium. No equilibrium's bad. So we're going to move upward along the new aggregate demand curve such that aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply. So the IS curve shifts out initially horizontally to IS1. AD shifts horizontally by the same amount, giving us AD1, right? Holding inflation constant gives us points not in equilibrium. That increase in the real interest rate is going to put us at a new point on the same monetary policy curve, and this point would line up to the point where aggregate demand 1 and short run aggregate supply intersect, right? So the interest rate is going to go up to a point where we have an intersection between AD1 and short run aggregate supply, which is our pi t plus 1, yt plus 1, right? And it happened because the interest rate, the real interest rate, went up, giving us this new equilibrium. So where those two guys intersect, we draw a dotted line up to the IS curve, trace it over to the monetary policy graph, and that's our new interest rate. The new interest rate is going to be higher than what it was before. We draw the point where AD1 equals SRAS down to the y-axis. It'll tell us what the new level of output is. We're going to have higher output, higher inflation, and a higher real interest rate. So if the government thinks that it's a good trade-off to have higher output, even at the cost of higher inflation and a higher real interest rate, hey, good on them, man. That works. We're happy. But they've got to sort of weigh out their cost benefits here, right? Because it's not always a good idea just to go, you know what, we want higher output, so we're just going to do some fiscal policy to get it, because you are going to be driving up inflation. You're going to be driving up interest rates, right? A lot of what we're seeing right now, right, as of October or September, soon to be October, 2021, right, with pretty high inflation, right, some of the highest inflation we've ever had. A lot of what that is the massive fiscal policy stimulus that has been coming out, right? You're essentially giving a lot of people a bunch of money, but with all sorts of the supply chain holdups that we're experiencing as a result of, you know, not really evenly recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic with the shutdowns and whatnot, supply isn't exactly where it should be, but demand is really, really high. High demand, low supply, higher prices. Well, prices keep going up and up and up. Boom, that's higher inflation. So this is where we are. Okay, the aggregate demand curve shifts out. We have to achieve an equilibrium. So we trace that dotted line back, over, up, all that good stuff, and we get a higher real interest rate. So make sure you get a really good idea as to what happens here, because this is how we get to our first short run equilibrium in the aggregate demand shock that you saw previously. Now, in the long run, as short run aggregate supply keeps shifting inward, right, the real interest rate continues to go up. Now, I'm going to skip all the incremental steps here, right, and just jump to where it was at the very end. So I'm just going to shift short run aggregate supply all the way back in. So it's going to go back to that blue curve, right? This is what we get. So as it shifts all the way back in, shifts in until AD1 equals LRAS, and that's our new rate of inflation, and our level of output is what it was prior to the shock. Then we trace up to the IS curve, the new IS curve, the second one, and then over, and that's going to be our resulting real interest rate. So the government spending shock increases the real interest rate, and it increases inflation. But in the long run, it doesn't change output. It boosts output a little bit in the short run, but eventually that changes back to where it was. So as the short run aggregate supply curve shifts all the way back in, higher rate of inflation, higher real interest rate. Right, now the magenta curves, points, dotted lines, all that stuff, those are the short run responses. The blue stuff are the long run responses. And as we can see, the real interest rate keeps increasing because as short run aggregate supply keeps shifting in and output drops, the real interest rate goes up. Inflation keeps rising because holding demand fixed with a falling short run aggregate supply, price level continues to rise. Firms update their prices each period, thus they increase inflation until all firms have been able to increase their prices. So let's look at what the model would generate quantitatively. Right? We looked at this stuff qualitatively, but we want to see what happens quantitatively and what happens dynamically. Right? We can look at both of those over time, actually. It's really nice. You just have quantitative response on one axis, time on the other. So we're going to look at the magnitudes of the responses to an IS shock over time. Now, essentially what's going on is we take like a lot of the equations that you just saw, put them into a computer, give it a bunch of initial values, and then just literally just hit enter and just let the damn thing run. And it's going to predict what happens based on the conditions that were put in place, right? Like, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, all that fun stuff. It's going to generate these responses to shocks that are known as impulse response functions. We assume the shock hits at time t equals 0, and we're going to watch how the endogenous variables evolve over time. So let's take a look at this. Now, I want to say this image was taken from a different lecture by a professor at Notre Dame, named Eric Sims. The guy's awesome, actually. I've used a lot of his materials for my lectures. He's actually got a really great textbook that's out that I've used to help kind of formulate some of my lectures. I've looked at his own lecture slides before. The guy's amazing. He's an excellent resource, and he's really guided a lot of what I use to teach in my, time teaching. Now, just wanted to make sure I said that. I need to cite my source because, plagiarism is bad and all that stuff. Okay, so let's look at this. We have on the horizontal axis here is time. Now, everything that's negative is time leading up to the shock. The shock occurs at t equals 0, and everything after that is, after the shock. So let's look at what goes on, right? T equals 0, right? The shock hits, and inflation goes up. And inflation keeps going up. But let's look at, say, t equals 1. We'll assume it's here, right? T equals 1. Well, t equals 1 is probably right around, it's probably right here, right? The output goes up a bunch, and inflation goes up. So output goes up, and it peaks right after the shock. Inflation, however, has not peaked after the shock. It will continue to rise. It will continue to rise because what happened here, this shock, this movement here, right? This is along that first short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, as that happened, right, the real interest rate goes up because the government had to borrow stuff, crowded out investment, so real interest rate goes up. So we're here. This is our first shock. So let's see, where we are, that first little point I've been explaining is this AD1 equals SRAS with RT plus 1 is the interest rate, right? That's where we currently are here. Output goes up. Inflation hasn't finished going up. Real interest rate hasn't finished going up yet, but output is. Now, as the short run aggregate supply curve shifts a little bit in, more and more and more, right? Output begins to fall more and more and more. But we've got the short run aggregate supply curve now shifting along that downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So as it's shifting in and output falls, inflation is going to continue to go up. And in order to maintain an equilibrium, right, with the IS curve and the monetary policy curve, the interest rate, the real rate, has to keep going up as well. So as inflation keeps going up and output keeps going down, right, that's that short run aggregate supply curve shifting further and further in until we achieve our long run equilibrium. That's where output becomes flat again. That's where inflation becomes flat, and that's where the real interest rate becomes flat. So output spikes and it begins to drop back down. And as it's dropping back down, inflation's going up, indicating that short run aggregate supply curve is shifting in. And as it shifts in order to maintain equilibrium, the real interest rate keeps going up. Now, once output is leveled off, right, that short run aggregate supply is now equal to the long run aggregate supply. So inflation stopped moving. Similarly, the real interest rate has stopped moving because you've stopped shifting things around. So the real interest rate is going to converge to a new higher resting rate of about 3.7 or so, where initially it was at about 3%. Inflation was at 2%, and now it's just shy of 2.8%. So you can see here, right, if you need a quick little boost of output, that's great, but you're going to pay for it in the long run with, well, no real change in output and higher inflation and higher real interest rates. So looking at this dynamically is actually telling the story of what we looked at with the graphs, because each little point that I drew with the graphs explains a point on this curve, right? All these curves are explained by what we saw in that previous graph. So the qualitative responses for an aggregate demand, aggregate supply, the responses for that are going to be the same in a monetary policy shock, right? Just in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply space. The interest rate responses are different. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the interest rate responses here are different and what it would mean for the economy. Then we're going to look at the impulse responses for a monetary policy shock. Now, the IS shock was from an exogenous increase in A bar. A monetary policy shock will be from an exogenous reduction in R bar. Right? So the shocks originate from different functions that both drive demand. The demand shock is going to be similar, but the interest rate effects are going to differ substantially. In the monetary policy shock, the medium and long-term effects on the interest rate, the real interest rate, are zero. Why? Monetary neutrality. So we're going to think of this guy as sort of like a natural rate of interest, right? And this RT is going to be consistent with an IS curve holding at YTP. So we could think of this as maybe like RTP if that's what we wanted to do. RTP, like our toilet paper. Anyways, so this is what our resting natural interest rate, whatever you want to call it, right, is going to be defined by. Note that this above equation doesn't depend on R bar, right? So the autonomous monetary policy stuff, not driven by that. Not driven by that, well, it'll probably be monetary neutrality, wouldn't it? Yes. The answer is yes. So when the monetary authority wants to use expansionary monetary policy, the monetary policy curve shifts down. Lowers the real interest rate to RT plus 1, we trace this to a new point on the IS curve. This leads to a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. We trace the initial drop in the real interest rate over by the horizontal amount that aggregate demand shifts. But aggregate demand is not equal to short-run aggregate supply. The interest rate increases from RT1 to RT2. Brings us to an equilibrium in which the pink aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply. Boom, here we are. Okay, so what you see in black is where we started. Ignore the pink stuff for a second. Right, this is where we started. Now, we're going to shift all the way down from RT to RT plus 1 when this black line shifts down to the pink. Right? So, we were here, now we're here. We're going to trace this over to the IS curve. The IS curve does not move in a monetary policy shock because there's nothing monetary policy related in the IS curve. So don't freak when the IS curve doesn't shift in this case. Now we take the IS curve, right? We draw it down, and that tells us where the aggregate demand curve shifts. We just draw this dotted line down until it's at a point that's horizontal with IT, the initial rate of inflation. And aggregate demand shifts horizontally by that amount, right? But we're not in equilibrium here. So what do we have to do to be in equilibrium? Well, we're here, and we want to be here. We're going to move along this point here. Now, as we're moving along this point, what's happening is the real interest rate is going up a little bit. It goes up a little bit. It doesn't go up all the way back to where it was. It just goes up some of the way over to RT2. Right now at RT2, that is the interest rate that's going to be consistent with a short-run equilibrium. That's, well, pretty much everything I described over here. Right, so when you look at this, then look at this graph, this explains everything that happens right here. Right, but when you go from the short run to the long run, we get firms updating their prices like what we had in the IS shock. Short run aggregate supply shifts to the point where this blue short run aggregate supply equals the pink aggregate demand equals long run aggregate supply. Output's going to fall back to the long run aggregate supply. Inflation increases. Now, when this happens, the real interest rate increases up until it reaches where it was prior to the monetary policy shock. The long run response of the real interest rate to a monetary policy shock is 0. In summation, the long run responses are, well, real interest rate is 0, drops, but it goes back to where it was. Output, 0, goes up, but it goes back to where it was. Inflation, positive, it goes up and, well, kind of stays high. Nominal interest rate, well, yeah, that'll be negative. This is how monetary neutrality works in this model because the real variables, real interest rate and output, they're unaffected. The nominal variables are affected. Right? So this is what we get. Short run aggregate supply shifts back in. We have a higher rate of inflation. Output is back to where it was prior to the shock. We trace over, and what do you know? The interest rate consistent with this long run equilibrium is the interest rate that was consistent with the long run equilibrium prior to the shock. That is what monetary neutrality is. Real variables are unaffected, only nominal variables are affected. So let's look at the impulse responses for a monetary policy shock. These impulse responses here are for what's known as a contractionary shock, meaning the interest rate was raised to cut inflation. So by default, output falls as well. Now, this has been done in the past, but it's not very common. Now, before you freak and you're like, but this isn't the same type of shock as what we just saw. It is, actually. What you saw in the graphs was an expansionary shock. This is what's known as a contractionary shock. So instead of cutting interest rates, here they're raising interest rates. But this is a linear model, right? It's linear in parameters. The slopes of these things are all linear. So the magnitudes of the responses are going to be identical, just the signs are flipped. So you can flip the signs of these response functions and think of that as how the model predicts a response to an expansionary monetary policy shock. But as we can see, the impulse responses even show us that the real variables remain unaffected in the long run by a monetary policy shock. Right? So here, what we see, okay, well, everything's moving along just fine until t equals 0. Monetary authority raises the real interest rate. They raise the real interest rate to try to cut inflation. Works out quite well, right? Now what this is doing is, right, if you look, inflation is falling and output is falling. So when output and inflation move in the same direction, right, that's consistent with a demand shock. Output drops sharply, inflation drops, right? But remember, that's because prices were sticky. So if prices are sticky, inflation can't really fully respond yet. Now firms begin to lower their prices more and more and more, and as they do that, output begins to increase and increase and increase. Now as output's increasing and inflation is falling, the real interest rate is also falling. Now here, at this point in time here, It'd also be about here, right? We see we're still in a short run equilibrium. We hit the long run equilibrium when output begins to level out and output's basically just flat. Inflation's flat, real interest rate's flat. When all these guys are flat, we are now in our long run equilibrium. So try a couple of things. One, just on your own, look at these and just draw the flip of this, right? So literally just if inflation drops, make it go up. If output drops, make it go up, right? Literally just flip all these guys upside down. When you do that, look at the graph that is right here and try to see how it lines up, right? See if you can tell the story with the changes in these curves here with the story that would be observed if, say, output were to increase and then drop back down, inflation were to increase and eventually level off at a higher rate, the real interest rate were to drop and level off at, well, the same rate that it was before, right? So once you've done that, yeah, it kind of wraps up this lecture here. There's another lecture for the supply side shocks coming. Just like I said, this lecture started going on for way too long. I didn't want to make it longer, so I broke it up into separate lectures. So peace out. Oh, and one more thing, actually, if you're still listening. On top of just going, okay, flip these and see if it lines up with what this guy is here, right? Another little thing I'd like you to do is draw the contractionary monetary policy shocks on this graph here, and then see if it'll line up with the story that's being told with this right here. That's going to be two cool little things to think about. Now, that said, finally, peace out, and I mean it this time.